Stephan Delbos is a New England-born writer living in Prague. His poetry, essays, and translations have been published internationally. He is the author of From a Terrace in Prague, a Prague Poetry Anthology, and the author of a poetry chapbook in memory of fire. His collection of visual poems, Bagatelles for Typewriter, was exhibited at Prague's ArtSpace gallery in 2012. His play Chetty's Lullaby, about trumpeter Chet Baker, was produced in San Francisco. A founding editor of the literary journal Body, he teaches at Charles University and Anglo-American University in Prague. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Glad to be here.
So you moved to Prague. Why did you move to Prague?
Originally, I came to Prague as a student. So my junior year in college, I was in Prague for the whole year. And that was more of a, I guess, desire to go abroad. It wasn't specifically Prague until I chose Prague. Had a great year and loved the place, loved the people, made some important relationships. By the end of the school year, I had decided that I was going to come back after I graduated. Came back into a program, a TEFL, teaching English as a foreign language program. Started to teach at a language school, and time kept going by, but it kept being a city with a lot of opportunity and a very engaging city, and also a place that's very easy to live, just feels very livable. In those years, I was doing a low residency MFA program at New England College, so I was living in Prague, but then going back a couple times a year to go to classes and things. And now here, it's a decade later or more, and it's still a wonderful city and engaging and all of those things.
And you're teaching at Charles University and the other one, the Anglo-American?
That's right. And doing quite a bit of freelance writing as well. Ended up entering the PhD program at Charles University, which I just finished. So, yeah.
What was your thesis on?
It's on American poetry during the Cold War, and specifically this 1960 anthology, The New American Poetry, edited by Donald Allen and published by Grove Press. Looking at that anthology, which has been very, very influential and continues to be influential, looking at how the anthology was kind of grounded in the Cold War and Cold War cultural warfare, and how all of that kind of political and social atmosphere influenced the way that this particular anthology was put together. And because this anthology has been so influential, how the way we think about poetry, American poetry today, is still influenced by these kind of Cold War models. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, for example, which was this kind of a group that was sponsored by the CIA in the end, and they were financing magazines like Encounter and the Partisan Review and all of these, even the Paris Review, but also sponsoring exhibitions of abstract expressionist painting that would tour, especially kind of countries along the Iron Curtain or in South America and things, countries that were thought, on the brink of falling over to communism. And the idea by promoting, people like Jackson Pollock and so forth, and these abstract expressionist painters, was to promote, this idea of the freedom, in America, and that in the Soviet Union, you're prescribed to paint Soviet realism, which is not necessarily true totally, but that was the idea. And so look at our painters, they can do whatever they want. So anyways, there was an exhibition sponsored by MoMA, which actually the poet Frank O'Hara, who worked at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York City, he kind of helped organize this thing, unbeknownst, nobody knew until later that the CIA was funding this Congress for Cultural Freedom.
Stephen Spender had a magazine.
Yeah, Encounter.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And he didn't even apparently know that CIA was behind it.
Well,
and then he resigned, right?
That's one of the interesting, aspects. I mean, I don't really get into too much. All of this drama and intrigue forms the kind of background. There's a great book by Frances Stoner Saunders called Who Paid the Piper, the CIA and Cold War cultural warfare or something. And she really did a lot of the pioneering research on this stuff. A lot of, this has only come out recently with the whatever declassification. So, yes. So anyways, there was this particular exhibition called The New American Painting. And Alan went to the exhibition, which I find out examining his correspondence. And, so he then decides from The New American Painting, he hadn't chosen the title of the book yet, and he writes to Charles Olson and says, I saw this exhibition yesterday and it's given me a lot of great ideas of how to organize the anthology. So then you kind of have this interesting link between the anthology and that whole, Cold War cultural warfare and the presentation of American art and culture in a certain way and the nationalism. And
does that affect the content or the choice of the poetry, that it had anything to do with the Cold War or not?
The poems themselves on the surface, most of them aren't engaging really in politics or, overtly, but it definitely influenced, who he chose and didn't choose to be in the anthology. It's showing the permeability of this idea of nationalism and nation and how viable is that in terms of editorializing, and then that opens up into literary transnationalism and thinking about the birthplace of a poem and this and that, which people have been doing in the last couple of decades. This transnational, looking at the roots ROUTES rather than the roots ROOTS, the roots of influence in the way that T.S. Eliot is the American poet or a British poet. Henry James. Them, right? Yeah, absolutely. And you see, there's an anthology that I mentioned in the book, or hopefully will be a book, a dissertation, something, modern poetry, 1950 or something like that. And Eliot, there's two sections, British and American, and Eliot's in both of them.
Oh, okay.
So when you start, it's something that we take for granted. What is the new American poetry? It's poetry that's new and that's American. But what does that really mean? And then also,
where did it come from?
Yeah. And so, as you can see, it's
it's interesting, the connection with the Cold War and Prague and the writers here. They had to deal with censorship. It was a constant threat to their freedom of expression, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And that's what they defined themselves against in many cases.
And there's the famous thing from Philip Roth, when he's in the Klima letters there, thinking that were originally in the New York Review of Books. He questions maybe those writers under communism had it better because they had a kind of common enemy and a uniting kind of force and a target and things, that's...
Yeah, and something to direct their anger.
Yes.
Toward, and anger is such a terrific motivator, isn't it?
Absolutely,
to creativity,
absolutely. Especially if you have a target. But it has been very interesting to work on this type of the Cold War period and things, and being over here, and I think just being in Europe in general has given me a different, it allowed me to approach the topic maybe a little bit differently than I would have if I had written the whole thing in America, I guess, in the United States.
How's that?
Well, I think, maybe I wouldn't have even thought of this specific kind of project and this idea and this, transnationalism and what it means to be American. And I don't know, even the Cold War and all of that, historical and sociological stuff, that area. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that kind of point of view would have occurred to me.
So, you launched, along with some others, you were the founding editor of Body?
Yes, with two other close friends of mine and great poets and editors, Christopher Crawford and Joshua Mensch. And the three of us founded it, and shortly thereafter...
When was that?
That was when was that? I think it was in 2015, maybe? I don't know. I should probably know that.
It's quite recent then.
This is, let's see, no, maybe it was 2014.
Right. So you'd spent your time studying at the university to get your PhD and freelancing and writing some poetry. I
had started teaching at the university. I taught there for a few years before I started the PhD, which I did, that was 5 years ago, I guess. I guess it was probably right around the same time that we founded Body. The other editors at Body have been living here for a while. Christopher is from Scotland and Joshua's from, Canada, the U.S.
Same sort of thing brought them here? They love the place?
More or less, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's been, great. It really took off.
What does that mean, it really took off? You've got a bigger audience than you'd expected, or you've got people contributing from all over the place, or both?
Yeah, both. One of the things we wanted to do from the very beginning was to not just be a Prague publication. Mm-hmm. And we don't do print. It's only on the website, www.bodyliterature.com. And we don't even really do issues. We publish on a rolling basis. Mm-hmm. So we have a number of things we publish every week, and typically, there's poetry throughout the week, and then we have usually Friday pick or some kind of essay or criticism on Friday. We have a Saturday fiction series, and occasionally we do actual issues. We did a Czech issue a while back. We've done a UK and Irish issue. I think we have a Central or an Eastern European issue or something coming up very soon. Maybe Slovenian writers, fiction mostly. So in terms of the readership, it just has exceeded our expectations and continues to grow. And, just the way that people engage has been great. Of course, now everything on social media, social media is the left bank of the 21st century. You can establish community and things with people who live across the world. And we have very faithful readers and very faithful contributors from around the world. And
is this a labor of love, or you're actually...
Absolutely.
I was going to say...
sometimes it's love and sometimes it's something else. But no, we don't have any ads on the site. We have put a lot of time, when originally designing the site, we put a lot of time and thought into the way we wanted it to look. So it's very streamlined, very clean, no advertisement, and really presenting the texts in a way that, in a respectful way that gives them space. There aren't ads flashing, next to somebody's quatrain or something like that. So yeah, it's a labor of love, and we are actually going to be publishing our first book shortly. We don't have the specific publication date, but it should be sometime this year. It's a book of poems by a Czech poet named Milan Děžinský, whom we've published before. Translated by Nathan Fields, who's an American translator living in Prague. Both Milan and Nathan are longtime, friends of ours. We've known them for a very long time, friends and contributors as well to Body. So we're really excited to kind of kick off a small press, and we'll be starting with this great book, Secret Life by Milan Děžinský.
The poetry appealed to all of you. It must.
Absolutely, yeah. He's great. I mean, this is not his latest book. He's published several books. He's an award-winning Czech contemporary poet.
Yeah, but no one else outside of Czech Republic has.
We've published some of his work over the last few years. Maybe 8 or 9 poems. I believe he has published maybe a couple other places. Mm-hmm. He's in this anthology actually. Yeah, so this was back in 2011.
The one about Prague.
That's right, from a terrace in Prague. But yeah, so he hasn't been published in a book-length collection in English, so it should be exciting. And his poems are just really fantastic, so I think they're going to stir some hearts, hopefully.
I read about it. There was a controversy a couple of years ago. I don't know how big it was, but it was about, I think it was like coming in your mouth or something like that.
Yes, yeah.
Was that a big deal, or did I just stumble across something that was nothing?
That was an interesting chapter.
You were called misogynists.
Yes, yeah, we were. The poem was by Bobby Parker, and it's called "Thank You for Swallowing My Cum." We had published it, and we had published previous work. He's a British poet, contemporary poet, painting now as well. We published a couple of his poems before, but this particular poem we published, it was selected to be in a British anthology. The editor that year of the anthology was, I can't remember her name at the moment, but she was probably not a misogynist when she decided to include. Anyway, so what happened was we published the poem, and it wasn't a big deal, and then it was selected for this Best British Poetry Anthology, so we published just a notice on Facebook, Bobby Parker's poem, title of the poem. And that was just after another imbroglio that we were involved in. And so people already had their knives out, and then they weren't happy with that.
Just the content.
No, I'm sure most of the people who, I don't want to get too
No, sure.
But the content was actually, it's like kind of a poem in praise. It was really thank you, and it was about the title. And I think a lot of the people who were most upset probably didn't even, click through to read the poem. Just the social media controversy.
Well, it raised your profile, I imagine.
It did. It's not really it's such an electrifying issue right now, and as it should be. Because it's a real thing. You don't want to be on that side of the court, if you know what I mean. And I think it was unfounded, so and it blew over because there was nothing to it. So
okay, you can thank me for bringing it up. But it's interesting how, again, I'm doing a bit of quick research on it, and that came up.
Yeah.
Maybe we can return to that From a Terrace in Prague anthology. It's quite substantial. There's 350 pages. These are poets that have written about Prague, correct?
Yes, either poems set in Prague, poems about Prague, poems written in Prague. So some of the poems are, well, it's from 16 different languages, so some of those are Czech poets who lived here, some of them are people who visited or stayed for longer times, and some of them are people who are just maybe responding to an event that they read about in the newspaper, like John Berryman or Robert Lowell.
Yeah, or Edwin Muir.
He spent a lot of time here. Yeah, he was Kafka's first translator, actually, into English. He was here in 2 periods. He worked for the British Council.
Gary Snyder.
Yeah, he's been here for the Prague Writers' Fest a couple of times. So I think that was based on, he was actually here.
Is there any particular poem in this anthology that really blows the top of your head off?
Yeah, there are a few. It was just such an interesting project because I had enough to know that it was a good idea and that it could make a good anthology. And then over about a year and a half or so of research and compiling, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and more interesting. You have everything from, of course, contemporary poets, who are living here now, to great poets, really famous poets like Allen Ginsberg or Marina Svetaeva, or, of course, Rainer Maria Rilke, or Pablo Neruda, Nazim Hikmet, great Turkish poet. There's so many great poets from so many different nations, One of the greatest Turkish poets ever, one of the greatest Spanish language poets ever, some of the greatest English language poets. There's a Mongolian poet in here, so, there's so much, and that which is a tribute to the work and to the city, really. That's one of the questions I try to ask.
Why attract that kind of creative interest. And you've got photographs of all of these poets and little bios.
That's right, and little bios, and there's some notes in the back about the poems with some photographs and
a map too, right?
And a map, yeah. So I'm trying to design it as a poetic guidebook to Prague.
Is it a Czech publisher?
It's Litteraria Pragensia, which is out of Charles University, and there's a Kindle edition. The print run sold out, and it's available now on Kindle on Amazon.
You feel like reading one of them?
Yeah, there are so many. It's hard to narrow down. Yeah, well, I'll just read the first poem in the book, I suppose. Sure. Fitting introduction. This is a poet of the 19th century named Svatopluk Czech. Actually, there's right a block away, there's a little park named after him and a statue of him. And this is from a long poem called Prague. It's just the first 8 or 9 lines, and I translated it with Hanna Andračková. Behold, Prague. Vision sparkles, blearing, Prague. The name alone sings. The mere sound of it rapturously gets down into the strings of the Czech spirit and sets the heart beating a thunderous throb. Let foreign pilgrims take your modest measurements and scorn, Prague, your graying robes. To us, in your beauty, ancient gloom, you are luscious Naples, you are proud Rome.
It's true, isn't it, that Prague has this sort of gloomy black and white feel to it, or at least that's the image.
Yes, and especially now, it's so January, it gets dark early and the sun rises late.
And Kafka must have had something to do with that.
Absolutely. So it's not always, dark and gloomy. Prague in the spring, Prague in May 1st in Prague, it's, heaven on earth. So it's interesting. It really changes. And this, the cobblestones look different and things and the different light. And I think interesting, in that poem, he's let people say that you're gloomy, but we still love you kind of thing,
Yeah.
I think that's still true more than 100 years later.
One of your latest projects is The Absolute Gravedigger, that was published by Twisted Spoon Press, interesting sounding press, in 2016. These are the poems of Vítězslav Nezval, who was, maybe you could tell me a bit about him.
Nezval was a very interesting poet, 1900 to 1958, I believe, and in the 20s and 30s, especially the 20s, after World War I, 1918, Czechoslovakia is founded, the first republic. It's a nation, lots of positivity. The war's over. The 20s is kind of as it was in the roaring 20s in a way. But so in terms of poetry and art here, that's really when the avant-garde is in the modern, as we think about it in the 20th century, the avant-garde getting, boiling up, and Nezval was right in the center of that, one of the most prolific poets of the 20s and the 30s, gift with musical language.
But he was kind of multi-talented. He was a painter as well, I think I read something.
Yeah, there's some paintings in there. Actually, the cover is kind of one of his Decalcomanias, more of a print or something, I guess. The avant-garde, the 20s, it was not just poetry, it was painters and collagists and photographers and screenwriters and theater people, very vibrant and fermentative time. And he was right in the center of it, as I said. Into the 30s, surrealism starts to become more popular, and the avant-garde kind of morphs towards surrealism or moves towards surrealism. And again, Nezval was one of the main people, main contact with Breton and Éluard, and traveling to Paris. Breton gave a speech in Prague in 1934, which was the year that they formally signed off and giving the blessing for the Czechoslovak group of surrealists, which was apparently the first kind of official surrealist group outside of France. And so this book, The Absolute Gravedigger, comes from, there's three books that Nezval published in 36 and 37. They're not a trilogy per se, but they are, in terms of his body of work, it's the height of his surrealist poetry. And he, wrote and published these three books really quickly, in 2 years, It's kind of the high point of not only his surrealism, but in a way, his whole career as a poet.
Surrealism, just define that as a sort of Freudian dream.
It's a little complicated.
Yeah. But also there's all sorts of politics within those movements too,
yes,
right?
Yeah. I mean, the politics in that happened later in a way. The surrealists were interested in the unconscious, interested in letting go of the critical facilities, automatic writing, trying to access the unconscious mind.
Get away from the rational.
Yes, get away from the rational. And so in dream states and dream writing, that was all part of that project. We can see it, formally in the way that the poetry is written. Often it's a lot of litanies, and each line is an image. Dali came up with this idea called the paranoid critical method, and it was his kind of take on the surrealist method and how to access the unconscious. Looking at an object, and you work yourself up into this kind of paranoid mania as you see the different ways you could possibly interpret the object. So when you think about, Dali's famous paintings where it's kind of two images in one.
The reflections of elephants, that was a big one.
Yeah, it's like an optical illusion. You know what I mean? If it depends on how you look at it, it's one picture and then it's kind of another picture. Mm-hmm. And so, in many of his paintings, objects are kind of morphing into, they're kind of two things in one, morphing into another state or something like that. And so Nezval is doing that in this book. And so what you see is that the poem begins with a natural scene. Some of the poems specifically in the book. For example, harvesters, cutting the wheat on a field, and then it turns into something different and turns into something different and turns into something different and turns into something different. So there's a real freewheeling sense of
Freud's free association.
Yes, I suppose it's you could describe it as linked to that. You see that, so it's not simply these litanies of different images. All of the images are linked and are developing out of the thing that was in reality. That's the subject of the poem. And so, there's another poem about a woman milking a cow, and it becomes this kind of prostitute scene. The birds are sitting on the windowsill, and that becomes a fire, and then it all comes back to the milking scene. So it's this very kind of unexpected transformation, metamorphosis. It's quite interesting the way that he takes these surrealist methods and then combines his own innate musicality. Some of the poems in the book are formal quatrains using rhyme schemes, which is kind of his rejoinder to the Parisian surrealists who thought, that these litany poems, these free verse lists were the best way to access, the surrealist kind of unconsciousness. He's in this one section of the book saying you can do it in formal poetry as well, or at least I can do it in formal poetry. Anyways, and then Nezval's interesting. This is, as I said, is kind of the pinnacle of his poetry. And then he, after World War II and so forth, gets involved in, writing Stalinist odes and takes an official position. And
it was sold out then, did he?
Yeah, some would describe it that way. One of those complicated figures. There are so many of them here.
Yeah, that's simplifying. Obviously, it's not easy.
Yeah.
But he was I think he was some kind of a official. Something
took some kind of
right.
Maybe that was it. Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but some kind of official post. I like surrealist poetry. I'm interested in the whole project, and he has such a brilliant eye, and also the music and the language is just so musical, and it's absolute freedom, but formal perfection.
Many would define that as good poetry.
Sure.
The sort of limitations that set you free.
Yes, yeah. Cocteau said something about that. You have to escape through the cage or something.
Is there a short poem that exemplifies what we've just been talking about?
Sure. One very short free verse one, and then a short formal poem, just to get the variation. It's very rare nowadays to have a poem. First of all, it's a long book of poetry. Mm-hmm. And there's poetry, there's art. We've printed these, some of his paintings.
It's a beautiful book.
Twisted Spoon does really fantastic books.
They've got a website you can purchase this off?
That's right. It should be twistedspoon.com.cz. I'm not sure. If you just Google Twisted Spoon, you'll find it. Twisted Spoon is a great press, and they've published so many important works from authors in Central and Eastern Europe over the past, I think it's been about 20 years.
In their native tongue as well as in English?
No, just translated into English. So okay. Central and Eastern European literature translated into English. Poetry, fiction. They make beautiful books. The editorial work is fantastic. And the catalog they've built up over the years is it's really impressive and such an important contribution to people who are interested and want to find this writing in English, mm-hmm. which is sometimes hard to find. So let me read The Lamp. Around the lamp in the stairway, lighting the deserted chateau, built in the style of Art Nouveau, parades of shadows sway. Shadow after shadow bends down, in pairs kneeling, convulsively reeling, though not a soul is around. The lamp chimney is sooty, the wick gives off smoke, the shadows changing constantly cuddle and stroke. The lamp illumines this Sodom of figures resembling the figures of phantoms strangled and trembling. While the wick flares with purer and purer light, serenely it brightens the stairs and the shadows vanish from sight. So there you see candles in the stairwell, and it becomes this scene of shadow and light and phantoms, and then I'll just read this short one section of the book. As I was saying, there's just such an amazing variety of styles, from long narrative poems that comment on the rise of Hitler and the movings toward World War II, kind of tension in Europe in the late 30s, mm-hmm. to very short lyrics, to prose, to paintings, to formal work, and rhyming quatrains. And in the center of the book is a section called Bazaar Town, and it's I think 43 very short lyric poems with very clipped, measured language, short lines, and each is a scene from this Bazaar Town. It's interesting because this particular book doesn't really mention Prague specifically, whereas another of these three books, an earlier one, is called Prague with Fingers of Rain, and that is very literally set in Prague. A lot of the scenes here are in the countryside, but you can definitely, it is the Czech, it feels like the Czech countryside. And under the slender Gothic arch of a water tower stands a beardless young man, lamp in hand, in his vaulted chest a bell, When he coughs, the bell rings, and in the town, open, in one fell swoop, all the windows. So I should mention that I co-translated this with Teresa Novicka, who's a Czech translator and writer, and that's important to mention. And I will get us some more brew.
Would you say that one of the problems with poetry and literature in Canada and elsewhere is apathy? It's just that there's not that big an audience for poetry or for even for fiction, for that matter. But it strikes me that Prague is, and the Czech Republic, reading has been certainly really, really important to the country. I don't know if it still is or not.
Yeah, I read something the other day, or saw some headline that, there was a study, and Czechs are in Europe, I think it was a study about Europe, Czechs are among they read more than most. You see people all the time on public transportation reading books. I think it's much more common. There's a new bookstore just opened downstairs. I mean, when was the last time you saw a new bookstore open? I don't know how it is in Canada, but I know how it is in the U.S., and there aren't many new bookstores opening up. I think in Europe in general, in my experience, there is something in my, just in my observations of different cities and countries, literature and reading is kind of more woven into everyday life. In the States, maybe you have to drive. Well, Borders is out of business, but you would drive to the mall or to the strip mall or whatever, and go to this gigantic book emporium, which is 3 floors or something. And whereas in Europe, in any city, in the center of the city, you're going to just walk by little bookstores. I mean, on Wenceslas Square, there's 4 not tiny bookstores. And also then about translation and things. And here, in Europe, much more translation happens and people are reading. It's not like people are just reading the Hemingway book that they got assigned, in high school or college or something, but just contemporary writers. And that all seems more of a part of the culture, less compartmentalized than it does in other places in the States, I think. But again, I mean, I haven't lived in New York City or something, so maybe that's not the case. Just my observation.
What about as a poet? Do you have any guiding principles around why you create that drives your output?
Yes, it changes. Looking at In Memory of Fire, some of those poems go back 10 years. I'm so glad that all those poems are in that book. I still think they're all real poems and things. You know what I mean?
No.
I chose those ones specifically. I think those are some of the best poems that I've published. And I can read them now and I see that the approach that I was taking to the poem, or even the kind of impetus to make the poem, the moment that presented itself as being something poetic, worth of writing a poem, and is different from where I am now.
Can you explain the difference?
Yeah, I mean, so those poems, some of those the poems in there. In Memory of Fire, it's an elegy. It's a very elegiac book about loss and trying to hang on to things and trying to grasp for some sense of permanence in an impermanent world. As a somebody in their mid-20s and late 20s, those were some of the issues that I was grappling with, and also just formally, I can see there are at that time. I was very concerned with kind of the physicality of the language and the musicality, and just trying to really pressurize the language, make everything really musical. And now I think just where I am, I mean, I'm married, I have a 4-year-old son, more accomplished, I've had some publications, and it's not like I'm not questioning the universe or my place in the universe anymore, but those issues aren't as pressing. What's inspired my work in the last few years has, just been different things. I mean, I wrote a series of poems based on current events and, the news and things like that. Obviously, and now my last kind of manuscript that I'm putting together is inspired by fatherhood. So, experiences that I hadn't had when I was writing those poems. But I think the main thing for me, what I mean by they're still real poems, I can see that, I'm not in that place now where I was, but I still stand by the verbal expression. The language feels right and real, and
you're not embarrassed by them.
No, that's a simple way of putting it. But so there's one word in there that I, because these poems, right, they never, what did Valerie say, right? That a work of art is abandoned, it's never finished. So there is one word that I have changed since that came out last summer, but that's not bad. So they feel done, and so I'm happy they're all out in a really beautiful handmade chap.
One of my favorites is actually the first poem, the In Memory of Fire. Could you read that?
Sure. In Memory of Fire. Until our flesh gives birth to bones, when the bridges of our fingers fall to earth, until our eyes ignite in memory of fire, flashbulbed as the dead sockets of blind men, when this prophecy is elegy, we won't remember that May evening in a park when the flickering lanterns of lightning paraphrased our faces, but until the beds in which we slept are cinders, and those cinders ash, and ash a vacant story for the wind, until that city where I reigned the wild carriage of your tears becomes a tenement of ice, the borrowed letters of our names a scattered flock of startled crows. The days we shared are indestructible.
Now, how do you feel about deconstructing that?
In French theory terms or in conversational terms?
Yeah, in terms of what tricks are you using to appeal to me? There's a toolbox that you've got. What tools are you using?
So it's one sentence, and builds up the momentum and builds up to this final crescendo. The line, which is basically an iambic pentameter line as well, which is a very for English speakers is very rhetorical and classical and
natural.
And also natural, yes, yeah. And the inevitability, the poem kind of builds up. In the meantime, the repetition of until and the semicolons, kind of keep the tension going, keep the poem moving forward. There's music in it, but it's not formally rhymed. The rhyme is often internal rhyme or off rhyme, and it's not a repeating pattern, so it's moving forward and kind of pressurizing the language more and more as the rhymes happen.
Okay, let's look at off-rhyme. What's that?
So evening and flickering, for example, it's flickering and bickering would be a full rhyme.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a genius thing, but let me see if I could find another example. Until and indestructible, for example. And then internal rhyme, sockets of blind men, when, so the two rhymes, This time I was also thinking a lot about enjambment, and my friend Chris Crawford, my fellow editor at Body, described like the line breaks, and I was trying to pressurize the beginning of the poem and so the lines would start really strong and end really strong, and he called it like the way you move down through the poem, especially one like this. It's kind of like throwing a bouncy ball down a chimney. It's moving down, but it's bouncing back and forth as it moves down. I was really trying to think about having this really solid structure, and then you're just with the line breaks and the caesura and the enjambment and, and the semicolons and the punctuation all throughout, you're moving. You're not stopping at the end of every line and then starting again. It's all kind of tucked into this, the energy and the flow of the poem is much more kind of dynamic. I don't remember exactly. I do actually, I do remember. Remember, I wrote this in Prague, and then I was in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where my parents live in the summertime, which I would always be writing a lot there and kind of on summer vacation. And I remember really trying to get this kind of, I had part of it, but trying to get it into the form took a while. The carriage of tears, the city where I reigned the wild carriage of your tears. That was when I found that was the kind of key. That was the last thing that I really needed. I remember I was trying to think of a metaphor in it, and then finally I came up with one, which is, I'm sure that's what everybody goes through to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
But this for me is a summation of my worldview, at that period of time. The days we shared are indestructible until the end of time. Whatever happens, the shared experiences that you have and the relationships, and even if the relationships end, you still affect that person for the rest of their life, I think at that time I was single and then not single and then single again and then not whatever.
Through the writing and the rewriting of that?
No, I wasn't formally dating anyone at this time. I think I didn't have. It was after this long-term relationship that I had that kind of brought me back, and at that time living in Prague can be a very transient city. So meeting people, making friends, they move away. Traveling, you meet people. Especially when you're younger, you're on your own, you're open to anything. You meet somebody at a hostel and decide to go to the bar with them or something, and then have a great night, and you never see them again, and it can affect you forever. It feels appropriate to have it as the opening poem, to have it as the title poem of the chap. Yeah, I mean, it's something it still feels right, still stand by, still believe.
Just finally, is there a poet or several poets, both whose work and whose outlook or behavior you'd like to model yourself on? Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I can see how, looking back on the last, really since adolescence, when literature became something that was important to me, I can see there were different, not necessarily models, but just get into something, and I want to really get into it kind of all the way. I mean, we haven't even talked about playwriting and in fact let's just touch on that. You wrote up and you're really doing a service for Prague writers and poets and composers. Smetana, really interesting life, great music. And you mentioned tragedy. What was the tragedy? The tragedy was that first his first wife died. His I think 2 or maybe even 3 daughters died. He eventually lost his hearing. Eventually, basically went mad and died in a poor insane asylum. Kind of classic story in a way. In the meantime, he'd sold off. He went deaf and couldn't teach anymore, and sold off all his work to this theater for no money. Had to move out of Prague into his daughter's farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. And it's kind of like what I was saying about the anthology, or even what I was saying about the, my Cold War poetry research. You have a good project when you have this idea, you think the topic, and what you know about the topic is enough to make you think that it's a good project. But then when you start to really research and do more work, and it keeps deepening and opening up, that's, in my experience, it's when you're really onto something. It was the same case, Smetana, his famous, the melody from the Vltava, the Moldau. That's just one of my favorite pieces. Me too. I mean, it gets me every time. Yeah. And that was something that I heard very early on, here in Prague. And then for a while, on Czech Airlines, when you landed, that was the kind of muzak that would come on, which is funny. But anyways, and so I, liked the music, and at some point, I guess... You're a musician, right? You're a jazz guitarist. Originally. I don't really... Now I just, I play with my son. He's a budding drummer. But when I was in college, I played in jazz bands and things. And so that kind of inspired the Chet Baker play. And I had done that, and I guess I was casting around, for something new. And I just happened to be looking into Smetana's life and saw all of these things about his story. And, of course, he was like Svatopluк Czech, the poet from the anthology that I read in the 19th century, the Czech national revival, people trying to establish Czech culture and Czech language and music. And so Smetana was, in 1848 in the revolution, he's on the barricade at Charles Bridge, almost gets his head, blown off, and then kind of settles down into a more, stable life and career, but is still trying to create Czech music and use Czech melodies. And so that was interesting. And that, again, nationalism, I guess it's something that I'm interested in. But the political thing and then the personal elements are tragic and dramatic. And then, the music is wonderful. And so it was a great project at the Prague Shakespeare Company. And my wife, Amy Huck, directed the play. And it was, it was fantastic. Great reception, great houses, sold out houses every night. And when was that? No, that was just about a year ago. It was last March, something like that. Right. Actually, I have last March. Yeah, I'd heard about the Shakespeare Company here.
Yeah, they've been around for many years now, and they do not just Shakespeare, but they commissioned this play, and they, not too long before Deaf Empire, they did a Kafka, Amerikafka, it was called Amerikafka, interesting Kafka-based play. They've done a lot of really interesting projects. You were asking me if there's a writer or poet that I would model myself on, and I was saying certainly not Smetana, but I get interested by someone, by a character, or by a subject, and really try to explore it as deeply as possible. So, over time, there have been people that were important to me, different writers, and I'm trying to answer the question now. I mean, early on, Rilke was important, and then the Beats, Jack Kerouac from Massachusetts, that whole thing was important, and this is going back to high school, really. Robert Lowell was important to a certain extent for a period of time. I don't know. I mean, it changes. Obviously being here, I've been opened up to a lot European literature. I just wrote a review of JeanDenis, this Syrian poet. He lives in Paris. He's in his 80s. Admire that. There's a Polish poet, Adam Zagajewski, I really love. Obviously Nezval and other Czech poets. The post-World War II avant-garde, that whole thing. I don't know. Right now I'm reading Emerson. I'm going through this early American phase and becoming a transcendentalist for the winter. If I had to give the exact answer right now, in terms of this minute, these days, it would be Emerson.
Just finally, so if someone's planning a trip to Prague, what would you suggest they read? I mean, there's your...
Sure. Yeah, I mean,
it's a good way to sort of dig into to get the surface of a lot of different poets, and then they can go deeper if they wish to. Is that available?
It's available on Kindle, yeah. So if you have a Kindle or, an iPad or whatever.
And it's called?
From a Terrace in Prague, a Prague Poetry Anthology, edited by Stephan Delbos. So yeah, you can get it on Amazon, and maybe, some people are probably put off by poetry, but of course, the writers like Kafka and Hrabal and Ivan Klima and so forth. But the anthology's really been designed to be utilitarian. The foreword, the afterword, the notes, it's not dry academic writing and criticism. I've received a lot of great feedback from people just saying that it was, before they got here and even, or while they were here or after. Just gives an interesting kind of different portrait on the city. Jaroslav Seifert won the Nobel Prize. Czech poet won the Nobel Prize in, I think, 1981.
How do you spell his name?
Seifert.
He's translated in English?
Yes, there's a couple books. Ewald Ossers, Osers, was a great translator of Central European languages, died a few years ago. He has published or translated a selected, I think it's the selected poems of Jaroslav Seifert.
What about prose?
Ivan Klima, very interesting contemporary writer. Alex Zucker is an interesting American translator of Czech fiction. And he's recently published, or rather translated, this book, 3 Rooms by Petra Hulova, who's a contemporary Czech fiction writer. And, really, I would check Twisted Spoon's catalog because they published contemporary writing. Emil Hackl, he wrote a book. He's a contemporary novelist, Hackl, Hakl. He wrote a book called Of Kids and Parents, I think. That was published by Twisted Spoon, and that's, really interesting in terms of just contemporary Prague kind of street scenes. Joachim Topol, Topol, is another contemporary novelist. He's been translated quite a few times. Gargling with Tar is one of his books.
What about nonfiction? Anything that comes to mind?
Klima's
written some interesting essays on totalitarianism.
Klima's book, The Spirit of Prague, is interesting. There's a book called Prague in Black and Gold, which is interesting too. There's a great, for more literary and intellectual history of Prague, it's called Prague, the Capital of the 20th Century, A Surrealist History. And it's by Derek Sayer.
And has that got to do with the history, or has it got to do with surrealism, or?
It's kind of a literary history, mostly focused on surrealism, but it's making the case of Prague being the capital of the 20th century, the same way that Walter Benjamin called Paris the capital of the 19th century, I guess. Mm-hmm. Or did he call it the 20th century? Maybe it was the 20th.
Thanks so much for your time, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
I've been speaking with Stephan Delbos, who is a Prague-based writer. What's your latest project? Is there something you're looking on publishing in the next little while, or hoping to?
Working on another translation of Nezval, a second of these 3 books that I mentioned.
Twisted Spoon?
That's right. It's called Woman in the Plural. And I am finishing up a novel right now and putting together, kind of finishing up 2 poetry manuscripts, actually. It's funny because while I was the last 5 years working on the dissertation, I was still writing poetry and fiction, but didn't have time to really do anything with it. And so now I'm going back to the file cabinet and finding these things that I kind of worked on and forgot about. And so that's nice. It's been a nice surprise. So I have a couple things, a couple manuscripts of poetry that I'm putting together in this novel that will hopefully be sending out in the new year.
You have a working title on it?
I Echoed.
Great. Well, thanks again.
Thank you very much.